This episode was recorded December 22nd, 2024. Welcome to Muckrakers, where we dig through the latest happenings around so-called AI. In each episode, we highlight recent events, contextualize the most important ones, and try to separate muck from meaning. I'm your host, Jacob Hames, and joining me is my co-host, Igor Kravchuk.
Thanks, Jacob. In this episode, Jacob went to NeurIPS, so we're gonna completely ignore any other happenings, including the Anthropic and Redwood Research scheming paper and the O3 drop, although we will comment on the latter one very briefly towards the end of the episode, and we will completely constrain our universe to the wonderful world of academic conferences.
Yes, and we also thought it was worth mentioning there were two developments, I suppose, that I would say are more in the public eye than the typical things discussed about conferences. One was there was some racism that was in a talk from a speaker. NeurIPS responded with a statement on inclusivity. Essentially, we think this was handled decently by all parties, in that like this was called out, and the reaction was appropriate. There was an apology. Yeah. The other one is that there were some. There's a whole lot of drama around ByteDance and one of the best papers, visual autoregressive models. One of the lead authors did some sabotage, potentially. ByteDance is suing them. It's a lot of noise. Essentially, we're not going to cover these more than what I've just said because they are muck in the sense that they are noise. So let's rake past them.
What is, however, much more in the purview of what we like to focus on was a workshop symposium. What was it? Like the Solars event?
Yes, so this is the socially responsible language model research or something like that. And there was a panel there which included Joshua Bengio, Margaret Mitchell, and Jeff Clune. And then Jacob Forster thought he was a panelist, but he was actually the moderator, which the lack of structure that resulted may have been a cause for some of the interactions that were had, which got a little bit contentious. But like overall, I thought it was a really solid panel. And the question of the panel was specifically, is making AGI a socially responsible goal?
Like basically AGI, not just
Specifically
LLMs.
AGI, I believe.
And what was the verdict? Like, what was like the takes of people there?
Yeah,
How would you
so
summarize it?
they were mostly well, it depends. So I think Joshua Bengio essentially was saying not as it stands, like no, because of how we've set up incentive structures, um, and it could be. Margaret Mitchell, who I will go out and say is like was probably my favorite of the speakers. So I think her takes are really good. She's the lead on ethics at Hugging Face, but she essentially had a similar thing, but I would maybe even say more in the like the way that we're making them. Like we don't even understand the data that we're using, and there are issues with that in the first place. You know, bias, and there's also important consequences on the environment that are resulting from this. So I would say that potentially even more. She was saying it's not a socially responsible goal. Jeff Clune was on the fence, but leaned towards yes, it is a socially responsible goal, and made that like distinction clear that he did think it was socially responsible, largely because of the argument that like someone's gonna make it, so it should be me. Which, yeah, I don't know. I think that there's that's a slippery slope, and you need to be very intentional and cautious when you're talking about it, but I also like I'm not saying that it's completely baseless. And then Jacob Forster um, was even more on the side of socially responsible, but he was especially interested in essentially a forcing a false dichotomy of either it's open sourced or a single company has this AGI entity. Um,
When you say forced, like why do you say forced? Like it was like arguing for it in good faith, or why would you use the word forced?
so I would use the word forced because he did take his panel position, or sorry, his moderator position while also like being on the panel. Uh, he did use that privilege, so he like directed the conversation in this way, and explicitly like even tried to ask, let's do a poll, and poll the audience, you know, would you rather have one company in control of AGI or open source all of it? And Joshua and Margaret and Jeff Clune, I think, mostly stayed out of it, but Joshua and Margaret essentially were saying, um, well, there are other options. Like let's talk about what the other options are. And one thing that resonated with me that Margaret said specifically was, I have the quote here. 1 second. It's by a fear rhetoric that we give away our freedom. Um, and I think that to me this sort of interaction exemplifies something that happens within machine learning and like it is sort of happening by default on a larger scale as well, where the people in power, the companies, and the governments are wanting us to see this binary choice. Um, I mean, you could see it, for example, in like American politics. Um, you have a binary choice, and you have to pick the lesser of the two evils. Um, and to a certain extent, like that's true. You like I would say you should vote, right? Um, but also accepting that blindly puts you in a really like not good position, and is bad for the people in the long run. Um, yeah, I guess like what are your thoughts on what I just said? Because I did just sort of like word vomit out my ideas there.
I think without I think being at the panel, like I have empathy and like sympathy for the idea of this binary because like depending on how you model the problem, you can basically say there's like attractors that are like stable solutions to how things shake out. And like if we say like these things actually have an impact, which is like TBD. Like we're still like waiting to see all of the value that's being promised materialize, and the whole concept of AGI is like debatable. Um, if we swallow a bunch of codes to get to that point, you could make the argument that like a balance of power thing can work. Like a mutually assured destruction. Everyone has AGI, so we can kind of like live in the terror of at any given point somebody could say, "Hey ChatGPT, make me Ebola," and then like it does it. Or you could go a direction of like you have like some hegemonic, highly constrained thing, and there's like some control mechanism a la Bostrom and like OpenAI and so on. And I think the failure of that is not challenging the idea that this is like the only analysis that you can do, that like the option space is pre-constrained to a bunch of things. You have like certain assumptions that by constructions lead to that attractor. And like one
Mm-hmm.
example that I like to use is that humans are completely irrationally spiteful. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you play what is called the dictator game with people where like game theoretic setup, you get to decide to offer me like between 1 and like 100 cents, and then like if I accept, then I get what you offered me, and you get the remainder of like $1 that the experimenter gives. And then the rational thing would be to take a deal. Like even if you offer me 1 cent, like it's 1 cent, it's like better than zero. And I don't have any power in this game. So like the rational thing would be to accept whatever deal you offer me. But humans are irrational little bitches. And if you don't give me 50-50, then most humans will go, fuck you. And say no. Because if I don't accept the deal, then neither of us gets anything. And this is like the outcome that we observe. That like humans tend to be irrationally spiteful in the face of injustice. And that probably evolved for a reason, in that like if you do this type of action, you can take the game hostage. And even though you're playing with like an adversary who's like much more powerful than you and takes like rational optimal actions, you can still kind of like create a credible threat of like, if you don't give me a chance to do a fair-ish deal with you, I will irrationally cause you so much damage that it is actually in your best interest to like give me more than you feel like you have to. Because we can rationally sort this out, but I will not do the rational action. I will do the cause you as much harm as I can before I go down action. So that threat is a thing that is not modeled in this like scenario. And often in this discussion there's like this idea of, but extinction level risk is the worst possible thing. Like I don't think we have individually like the right to decide the extinction of a species, but there's also like no moral obligation to give up that bargaining position without getting a deal. And like that is not captured in this threat analysis almost certainly, that leads you to this binary outcome. So there's probably some other deal you can cut. I also saw an analysis online. Well, analysis, it was one tweet that basically
analysis in 2024.
Yes, like top level analysis, 50 upvotes, was the idea that the fact that we're doing this like chain of thought stuff moves more and more of the cost from just capital expenditure you paid once and then you get to exploit it into continuous operational expenditure. So like every time you want to use a model, you have to like spend more money, which then means that you want, like, it's in your best interest to make the model itself as good as possible, so you also spend less money, which means that sharing the model might become rational. And that this moves things towards like a form of open source way, but it doesn't need to be fully open source. It might be like some conglomerate of companies that does like a cooperative thing to share capital resources. Like there's different models maybe induced by that as well. And to wrap this up, because I've also been rambling a bit, but like, so I see Jacob's point there, and I get where it's coming from. I think it doesn't have a whole story, and I think this is like one of the mucky things we can point out, not necessarily on this panel, but like the overall communication style in this field, that people give you a well-polished story that kind of sets the frame, so that only the outcome of the story is the reasonable inference, but you can actually question the framing and whether the options that are given to you on the table and the assumptions are actually reasonable ones. Would be like one take I think we can add to the panel that is worth calling out.
Yeah, I think so too. And then just as like a final note, the other, I guess, like little tidbits that were interesting from it is Jeff Clune seemed to be, he said, I think at least twice, like something along the lines of like, if Yashua was in charge of the world, or like I would vote for Yashua or something like that, which is like, and then I think Yashua's response was like, if you're voting for one person, that's a bad plan or something like that. But that was interesting. Clune also brought up Dario's Machines of Loving Grace, like sort of fan fiction piece, which then Benjio said, excuse me, that's bullshit. You don't need AGI, which is what they're sort of trying to get to, in order to do any of those things. You can do all of those things with sane, specific, narrow systems that leverage machine learning. And so I thought I really appreciated that call out, because I think that's something that's missed oftentimes. Like, and then he even went on to say, like, the value of AGI and this like agency is replacing jobs. Is That's how you make money off of this. Um, all of these potential benefits that are seen as like the thing to hold up and to say, we're getting to this amazing place. Uh, you don't need the setups that these companies have gone into. So I think that's also worthwhile to mention.
I think you had also mentioned the shocking development that at the male-dominated computer science conference, Margaret Mitchell did not get as much like room to share her ideas and things as the rest of the panel.
Yes. Yeah, I guess not shocking. It's disappointing because, like, again, she's my favorite out of them, and I think she has like the most interesting takes. Um, but she definitely did not speak as frequently as the others. Oh, actually, there is one more thing before we move on, is that Joshua specifically called for computer science ethics standards and board, which I thought was great and I think is a good idea. I think there are people that are working towards this, and I think he may even be on some of those groups that are working towards this, but I think this would be good. And Meg specifically asked for a science around inputs to outputs, that is, data used in training and how that impacts the models that are learned from the training. And I thought both of those were interesting takes and like worth thinking about more.
I'd like to highlight that like Thomas Crandall Gilbert, I think what's his name? I always mix up if it's Gilbert Crandall or Crandall Gilbert. But has a paper called Reward Reports, which basically calls for exactly this. And there was there's a push in the community towards standardized exchange formats of metadata around training, which is basically necessary to do any form of like auditing and sanity checking on can the model hold up what they say. And of course, like OpenAI hates it because it involves actually telling the public how the models are trained. I think, and I want to be a bit like devil's advocate against my own opinions here, but like this might require some form of like algorithmic patent or like some form of like exclusivity period to make the game theory work out. But like if you release a model and you make this public, then for let's say 3 to 5 years you have like exclusivity on that particular like training mix or technique or whatever is like a reasonable amount of time, maybe like only 1 year given how fast this stuff moves. This might be a thing you need to do to make the economics and everything work out, even though I hate it.
Yeah.
Anyway, this was the spiciest panel that we actually found worth mentioning. The rest was actually science, and you found some themes that were worth
but
highlighting.
it is worth also mentioning the Ilya's talk, which is more just irritating to me than anything else.
Okay, before we go into the science, let's go to the test of time speech of Ilya Sutskever.
Yes, so he gave a keynote talk on, I think, like the second to last or last day of the main conference, and within it there were a couple slides that were, pictures were taken, things were underlined and circled and posted on Twitter, and essentially, someone says he's confirmed it, and they're talking about the slide where he says, pre-training as we know it will end, I believe, and talking about how the data is critical and is I think again in the slide it says like the fossil fuel of machine learning. Um, and what I thought was especially interesting about this is that even 2 months, 2.5 months before this talk, you could have said things like that, and people would have said things. People would have responded as like, "Oh, that's an interesting take." Um, no one, not no one, most people, I would say, were not thinking about it in this way, while some were. And then after it was, said by machine learning science researcher Prophet, everyone's on board, and the public opinion just like shifts like that. I thought it was, which is something that you called actually in I think a couple episodes ago, um, when I said when we were talking about the end of scaling, um, I said what do you think people are going to do about this, and you had said,
I can't give you my exact phrasing because
well, sure.
like highly compressed memory, but something like gaslighting is going to happen. That people will act as if everybody already knew that this was going to happen, and that nobody ever claimed that pre-training was going to get us there, and like this is false. Like the narrative for the last couple of years has been that like we're this close and we just need enough data, and that like we don't need anything else. There's no more breakthroughs, and if we need them, we will definitely get them easily. Like we're seeing the shift happen basically, where like this didn't work. We're nowhere near AGI, and now they're acting as if we always knew that this was only the beginning, and we need those extra billions. And that is a bit the shift that Ilya was doing also since he left OpenAI, with like, oh, what to scale is now the real question.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think that it's, yeah, I like just a little bit annoying, but it's hard to call people out on and say that, and I guess also just mentioning like when we say we're nowhere near AGI at the end of pure like pre-training scaling. I think that if you spend $350,000 to complete the ARC prize, maybe that's a different story. But we'll get to that when we talk about O3 at the end. So yeah, let's talk about science.
Just for some context before we like, this was the Test of Time Award, which is basically NeurIPS recognizing big papers from 10 years ago that had a big impact, and this was for like sequence to sequence learning with LSTMs originally. So some people were complaining about, oh, he didn't say anything new. This was not the place for that, basically, like to defend Ilya a bit as well.
Yeah.
But it is a change in messaging that is kind of also like a rewriting of what happened in the last 10 years, because like what happened was great advances in sequence to sequence learning. Good on you, Ilya. The claim that this was all we needed to get to AGI because language is magic and it has all of the human knowledge, and the model figures out the latent structure just via the text possibly, and like the multimodal might not even be necessary. And then the realization, oh no, actually we need that. And then also the realization, oh, actually, even that is not enough, and now we need to do test time scaling. And now we're in the story arc where they claim that this is now going to be enough, because now this is completely new frontiers and a paradigm shift. So both a defense and a summary of what happened. And now, science, like you want to say.
Yes. So yeah, there were a couple of themes at NeurIPS, and I will preface this with it's probably heavily skewed by the things that I'm interested in. So there were probably some other themes as well, but there's your disclaimer. Now let me talk about the things I'm interested in. First, there was just a lot of benchmarks for everything. There were some neat benchmarks. I guess I'll just like rifle through some of the ones that I thought were most fun. There's one called Whodunit Bench, which is like a multimodal agent mystery game benchmark. There's WikiDBs, which is actually not a benchmark, but it's just like a database for relational databases from Wikipedia. There's one called Assemblage, which auto generates binary executables based on GitHub code. There's one like Paloma, I believe, is also either a data set or a benchmark. And then my favorite name slash presentation combo is called 8bench. They tried to bring in bananas, and the security guard said that they couldn't bring in the bananas. So they just gave the presentation on 8bench, which was a benchmark for autoregressive neural emulators of PDEs, and then afterwards went outside and gave out bananas. So that was great.
Making sure the potassium levels of the conference were kept high enough.
Absolutely.
Why do we care about benchmarks?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of a twofold thing here. The first is benchmarks are how we've made and like these large data sets are how we've gotten to where we're at. But they're also very brittle, and I think you maybe put it best in how you described the inherent issues with like a sort of benchmark centric paradigm.
So there's a really cool paper that is actually like the one paper that has singularity in the title that is not bullshit. And it's called Data Science at the Singularity. Came from an OG data science professor, and he basically said like the singularity being like this thing of like things go pop and you can't predict what happens anymore. And he basically has like three things that made data science / ML / optimization theory, whatever, go brr.
Mm-hmm.
And that was well-defined benchmarks that have like real-world like applicability. Like as much as there's gonna be like a caveat
Which we give
to
an
this,
asterisk like, to, but
like it is not just toy models. It is something that is genuinely correlated with some task.
Yeah.
Or it might be just subsets of real-world tasks. For example, SWE bench is literally just like pull requests, right? So like there is a very real. If you do this, you're at least doing a subset of the real world. Widely sharing these benchmarks and the code that you use to solve them, so people can check your work. And then basically through that, like a culture of like rapid iteration and like little gatekeeping. And that competition that gets induced by that basically makes you go brr.
So and that can, another way to sort of like operationalize that is Kaggle, for example. Like this competition where at the end it's all open, but in the meantime, you know, like the thing that you couldn't do is not seen as a failure. It's seen as the next challenge. And then also just like globalization and access has also fueled
the
that.
fact that arXiv is the de facto arbiter of what a good paper makes, and like even if your paper doesn't make it into a conference, you can still get like citations, is like something that basically only astrophysics has achieved. And also the fact that like by default ML is open source, like even if it's on IEEE and things that are not open access, like there's a preprint, that is a pretty unique thing in ML that is like a good thing. However, there's two things that benchmarks kind of like suffer from. That is like my personal take. One of them is a bit like computer sciencey, so like you need to check me if I convey this correctly. But
okay,
the fact that we can make a benchmark out of something usually means there is a thing that we can verify in a somewhat automated way, and that we can give reference solutions to. And these two things inherently restrict the things we can benchmark. Because like there's this thing of like P and NP. It's kind of defined by things that might be hard to do, but easy to check. That's like NP. Things that are hard to check are again even harder because like you don't know when you have a solution. That's one. And then even if you think of our NP, like the things that are hard to do but easy to check, any benchmark that you try to assemble of NP-hard tasks will actually not be an NP-hard benchmark. There's a paper, wonderful title, It's Not What Machines Can Learn, It's What We Cannot Teach. Basically makes the argument that whenever you assemble a benchmark that is supposed to be about NP-hard problems, you're actually in co-NP, which is like what they claim a slightly easier subset. Because if your benchmark had any of the actually hard problems in it, you couldn't have assembled it. Because you would be out of the limit of your capabilities, what you can do, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one. The other one is a bit easier to grasp. And maybe was that clear? Like, is that like for
Yeah, no, I think that was essentially maybe it just before we move on, I can try to rephrase as well to see if that's helpful for anyone. And if it's not, when I listen to this back, I'll cut it. No, it'd be really funny if I just did like a cut there, like a very clear cut, but I kept that bit in. That would be good. No, so the let's see. Essentially, maybe this is actually best used with like an example, because it is perfectly characterized by an example. There was a work that we did at a part that went to a workshop at NeurIPS called Crypto Formal Eval. That's the short title. And essentially, it takes this problem that's used in verifying cryptographic encodings or like processes, and it uses that to like as a benchmark. These tasks are really hard to do and formally verify, and they use like their own coding syntax as well, and so you need to do a lot of scaffolding around like getting the model to understand or work within the syntax, and then you also need to have problems that you have solved. The thing is, we use cryptographic protocols that are not yet formally verified. So I think like the Telegram protocol was formally verified within 2024 or something, and like was deployed and used by people before then, right? Like at massive scale. This is something that just happens because it's so hard to do at that level. The ones that we can say, you know, like these are actually possible for an LLM to do, and we can guarantee that they're possible because we designed them and then verified them, is a very small subset of the possible problems that you could give in that space. So that's like the concrete example of
so your benchmark basically
problem.
Is something that actually includes things we haven't solved yet, but because it's a formally verifiable one, is like if the prover can run it, then you can still basically say, okay, this is correct.
So it doesn't include. It could theoretically include things that we hadn't verified yet, but it does not. Like it, because setting up these problems is also non-trivial. So it takes like a while to set them up and verify them. I was not an author on this one, so I don't have complete like knowledge of this, but this is what I was able to pick up on from helping them with their poster presentation.
Yeah. We can get feedback whether that was clear or whether this is also not in NP and actually also hard to verify if you are given the explanation. But the second one that is one of my eternal pet peeves is something that I relate to learning in games, and there's like non-stationary with stationary benchmarks. That like I kind of shocked Jacob in the prep for this episode by making me realize that like SW bench and a bunch of other benchmarks are not in fact dynamically updated realistic snapshots of like the current state of
I would have
coding.
sworn that SWE bench was continually updated. Like not the verified one, but the base was just taking the 1,000 most recent um, from the repositories that they're monitoring. But that is not correct. That is
It is
wrong.
2,249 PR request and issue pairs, and that means that like first of all it's gameable. Like you can have leakage, you can have like training data, distillation, a bunch of other things. But even beyond that, like this is kind of like if I were to train on pull requests from 10 years ago, I would be a bad programmer. Because the world does in fact move on. Like Python syntax changes, and like our technologies changes. What is a good solution changes. Like what is like best practice change. And like some of it is just like knowledge. You know, like the syntax thing, you can say, oh, it's just like semantics and like syntax. But like some of it also is like the definition of what is good evolves, and the definition of what is like a desirable thing. Like it used to be that microservices are like best practices, and now everybody has moved on from that because actually it's a huge mess. So that's what is meant with like non-stationarity, and like we actually came up with an idea of how you could maybe like define a more dynamic one, which has like ethics concerns, but like we might explore this. And like it boils down to like you need to like basically say like what Jack was saying, like take a snapshot of a living thing that comes up with like problems. So like GitHub issues, Fiverr tasks, eBay listings, whatever is like something like humans care about on an ongoing basis, and make a benchmark something like given a finite budget and time and constraints, how many can you chew through in that budget and time? Like
Yeah.
that would be like a meaningful benchmark that like a human will probably like always have a constant rate at that because like the humans keep up with the times, and then like the average human will be able to do like a constant amount of time as tools evolve and so on. And then your LLM needs to keep up with that as well. And if you can't keep up because the pre-training takes 3 months and costs millions of dollars, well, that's probably like a sign that you're not quite AGI yet.
Yeah. So I think that yeah, there are some interesting works in that space already. I think like Dynabench is like a framework for this kind of thing. But it's definitely pseudo tapped or sorry, pseudo untapped. Like I would say in large part we don't have great examples for this. Um, there is also the K Prize or the Konwinsky Prize, which was announced at NeurIPS. Oh, by the way, great like marketing trick, which I learned from this. Apparently, something that's like just kills at all sorts of conferences and things is when you do a product demo, typing out the thing live and then sending. People just eat that shit up, and I can confirm because I thought it was fantastic. He literally typed out the tweet live that he was starting this prize, and then he pushed send, and I was like, wow, that's fantastic. Yeah,
Also, a
so
lot safer than trying to actually like demo the product. Like, I think it's much more risky to like type out the prompt for your LLM assistant and then having that like choke up on screen. Like having the tweet, like it only relies on Twitter being reliable. Oh wait,
oh no. But anyways, yeah, so Kaggle and this guy, I forget, he's like, I think he started two different like Databricks and something else. He was like co-founders for them. Um but they're essentially doing another SWE prize, but they've set it up such that it's not gameable, or at least I think that he mentioned like you could game it, but it would require you to go through like all of these open source projects and do like resolve issues in like thousands of open source projects, and so like if you do that to game this, like I guess I'm okay with that. Um, but beyond that, at least it's at least much less gameable, and like less prone to leakage because it's like a time locked thing, and it requires the models to be open sourced, but it's essentially SWI verified, plus this sort of like added time lock prize thing. Um, so I think that's also interesting and something to watch, um, moving forward.
Okay, that's cool. So, summary of a benchmark, like going with our theme of like, is it relevant? Is it mug? Um, I would say more benchmarks are good. They're necessary but not sufficient. And if somebody tries to sell you that like, oh, humans are now like LLMs or ML is now human level because they solve benchmark X, they're full of shit. Unless a benchmark is something like literally what a human would do at the same price point and other things. And we're gonna get to that in the wrap up
Yes, and
later
that
on.
also I think isn't to say that there isn't value in beating benchmarks. Like in sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't. Um, so there's a lot of room for nuance. I think the next major theme that I picked up on, so there was a tutorial on the first day, as well as just a whole bunch of papers, to an extent that like I was surprised that there were this many. Um, but the tutorial was called Experimental Design and Analysis for AI Researchers, and it started with Mike Moser, who works with Google DeepMind. He was a great speaker. I really liked the tutorial overall, but essentially it was, hey, machine learning researchers, how we're doing science is bad. There are tons of tools from statistics and from other areas of research which we can be using and we should be using, and we are not. And that is eroding the trust of the public in machine learning and in the work that we're putting out. And this was not something that he was like saying it's you doing it either. Like he showed examples from his work that or works that he has been on, which he then like, redacted so he wasn't, like doxing these people for bad work. But these were papers that he had been involved with and like either weren't published or were published and then it was like seen after the fact. Where like the statistics was just not up to par. Like if you actually look at what you're saying, this correlation that you're claiming exists is completely fabricated. Um, and there were more papers and works that did this. So within and like I'll just go through these real quick, and then maybe we can talk about the ones you think are interesting or like your uh, thoughts based on what I just said. So Better Bench was essentially like a benchmark to benchmark benchmarks, as I think their term or like little phrase. But trying to uncover issues. There was also one about like ways to have more qualitative um, evaluations of LLMs. I think it was called report cards. Um, there was one about norms for datasets. There were two that took a look at the datasets and benchmarks track from 2022 to either 2023 or sorry, from 2020 to either 2022 or 2023, and looked at like the practices that were seen in there and how we could improve. There was one that took a perspective from the like study of dataset curation or of data curation. There was one called Croissant, which was a metadata format for ML-ready datasets. There was one about safety washing, which I also thought was interesting, where they essentially showed that like in half of the cases, more or less, performing well on so-called safety benchmarks was actually just measuring capabilities, or was highly correlated with just measuring capabilities. And then there were also a number of groups and people calling for evaluations of LLMs and other generative AI systems to be thought of as a social science measurement challenge, which was essentially what Mike Moser was saying. Like, we have these tools from these other places. We need to be using them to be able to make more robust claims. And the one thing that I thought was like especially interesting is one of the people in this talk asked a question and essentially said, okay, but like things are moving fast, so can I not do this? And like I'm not even joking. It was basically that. It was slightly more wordy and slightly more like veiled. But essentially they were like, this is great and all, but like I don't want to. Do I have to? And and Mike was like, yes. It was wild.
I
Yeah,
think you
anyways.
used the phrasing. I'm not sure if it was an exact quote, but something like, "We are in crisis and we need to change this because people have already lost trust in us, and like we need to get it back," or something like that.
Yes, that was like the framing. So he specifically cited in I think both in his talk and in responses, there was sort of like a crisis in the social sciences or in like psychology within the 2010s, where people sort of stopped trusting the outputs of these studies. And so someone asked a question, and it was basically, what are the indicators that we would be in this crisis? And his response was, I think we're already in this crisis. Um, so yeah, the state of scientific rigor is very poor. Normal people already don't trust the science at large coming from the machine learning space, and like I would argue that they have that like that's pretty justified. Um, and it's going to be hard to get that back at this point. I think it's possible, but like I do think it indicates sort of like where we're at and what needs to be done um, if we want to regain that like level of trust that maybe you see in other domains.
I think there's a few things that are like relevant context papers and comments on that. So like an acquaintance of mine, like I wish I could say like a friend because he was a really cool guy when I met him, but we only met once when I was visiting Mila, and like we haven't stayed in touch. But Jacob Buckman wrote a blog post in 2021 called "Please Commit More Blatant Academic Fraud," in which he did kind of a similar thing in kind of like shitting on his own paper. But he was basically saying like, yeah, this was a bullshit paper. Like this paper is complete bullshit. Like I kind of knew what I was writing it, but we got it through the review process, and it's a bit bullshit. And he kind of goes into like the same theme, but like not on a like scientific rigor thing, but more like in a like we upsell things way more than we should. And I think that hits into like the same line. There's also currently drama going on in like two fields, both like protein design around like AlphaFold and also dream plays like circuit design with RL optimized layouts, where basically the domain experts are saying, no, Google, you did not solve this. Go fuck yourself. And actually, Jeff Dean has responded. There's like the False Dawn reevaluating Google's reinforcement learning for chip macro placement was like the instigator of the drama. And when they actually replied in like a preprint is like that chip has sailed, a critique of unfounded skepticism around AI for chip design. And there's now like follow-ups on it. Like there's an ongoing like like academic drama, which is very juicy, but it kind of highlights a similar thing. And beyond drama, there was also other papers that we're gonna link in the show notes. In 2019, Joël Pinot launched or helped launch the NeurIPS reproducibility program. And she led with other people a paper improving reproducibility in machine learning research. And she was mainly focused around RL because, by God, that was a horrible state at the time. And that actually has like led to a response in the community that now in the RLC, the RL Reinforcement Learning Conference, there's quite strict guidelines on how you should actually do a technical eval and how you should critique one, which I actually learned a lot from, including things like, no, plus minus STD is not a confidence interval. Like, do your stats test and actually like draw the thing that is meaningful to interpret. And also, you can't just claim a ranking without doing like a Wilcoxon like test to distinguish elements in the ranking. And things like that are, I think, good to call for. I personally love a paper from 2015 on the same beat that is called A Metric Learning Reality Check. 2020 actually. God, this field moves fast. I thought this was 10 years ago. Anyway, it checked out the progress in metric learning, so like taking positive, negative, and neutral examples and trying to like learn a meaningful distance in the semantic space like explicitly. And you want to guess what they found? Was there meaningful progress, or was there no meaningful progress?
I'm gonna go out on a limb and say there probably wasn't.
So, assuming their results are correct, which is always like a possibility that they didn't, once you correct for like changes in implementation, redefinitions in metric, and all that stuff, they found absolutely no progress in 4 years of research, and they have like 15 papers, and they have a very nice plot in the paper. I'm gonna show to Jacob, and the audience can check out Figure 2 on page 13 of the linked PDF.
I'll put it in the website page for the show notes.
Trend according to papers, and then trend according to reality.
Wow, that's awesome.
And there's zero relative improvement. Well, not zero, but like not statistically significant or meaningful over 5 years of research, more or less. And I think something like that is highly likely to also be the case in other fields of ML. And I want to like add the last concept onto it, why that also really matters. Like, there's an idea called performativity that I sometimes ramp on. And I met like one person this weekend that had already seen it, which is very rare. And Moritz Hart pushes this a bit, but very few people are aware of it. It's the idea that when you have an optimizer or you're doing optimization, there's 2 ways how you can get your loss to be better. You can collect data from the real world and meaningfully change your algorithm until it does better on the problem setup.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can change the problem setup to make your algorithm perform better. Or the algorithm can affect the world and make it easier. Like the term performativity comes originally from social sciences, was brought into quantified stuff by a quant finance researcher that basically made the claim that it is plausible that the Black-Scholes options trading model does not work because it describes reality, but that it was sufficiently sexy with enough knobs to tune to justify your gut feeling that it has actually become to describe reality because it was adopted by enough people that now use it to trade.
Right.
And for this context, what is very plausible that could happen is that like ML claims it makes advances. It uses this claim of advances to justify additional investment in data collection and compute and shaping the world to be more amenable to ML. And then, because of this, the same algorithm that actually did not have any advances, it just was badly reported and overclaiming, actually starts performing better, but not because the algorithm was better. It's because also the previous algorithm is now performing better because the world has adapted and has made itself more amenable for the general field. And we see this in things like hardware lottery. We see this in things, like benchmark gaming. All of these things can
I
be
think that
instances of this.
the like most clear example, maybe accessible version, is like prompt engineering. Um, this idea that like you can, if you know what you're doing, you can construct a prompt that just gives you better outputs than if you weren't trying. Um, and then if you know how to do that and do that well, you get better outputs. That is not the underlying algorithm changing, but that is you changing the input to the system. And it still has the desired effect, right? Like it still does mean that we have a better output. But there are two ways that we could have gotten to that better output. Um, and being aware of that is like also important.
I think it's another. It could be like if your process involves models that are doing algorithmic artifacts, then gaming those artifacts changes the nature of like benchmarks as well. Like if we use algorithmic evaluations to define progress, then it becomes easier for machines to actually match that because we're no longer using humans to evaluate things. We're like dumbing down our evaluation procedure in the name of scaling.
Mm-hmm.
And there was actually some papers along those lines that checked the dataset manually for like confounders, for labeling errors, for stuff like that, and then reported like the clean performance versus the real performance and stuff like this. So these were like some concepts I wanted to drop into that thing, but I think it's like good. I think like the muck, if there's anything, is like the muck on the whole community, and this workshop or like this tutorial is trying to dispel it. I would say is like how we can summarize this theme of the conference.
Yeah. And then I guess there's really only like one remaining theme that I picked up on that I thought was interesting. Um, and that was that Anthropic and OpenAI had they didn't have booths, whereas everyone else did. And I personally met one researcher from Anthropic and one researcher from OpenAI. Although, well, rather, I personally knew of um, one researcher from Anthropic and one researcher from OpenAI. I'm sure that there were more, but their presence was substantially lower than that of Google DeepMind and Meta. And I thought that was interesting.
Why do you think that is? Do you think they're so far ahead that they don't need to mingle with the plebs anymore, or like they're so important that they shouldn't go to these places? Or what is the rationale of not going to what is kind of like NeurIPS and ICLR are like I think the biggest and conferences, and then like ICML is a closely following.
Yeah, so I actually looked this up just because someone was asking about it and we were curious. NeurIPS is the biggest by at least a little bit. There were over 15,000 people there this year. And ICLR is close behind, and then behind that is ICML. So I think there are a couple different potential things here. One take that I thought was interesting and is at least worth considering is like the framing that when in the like in World War II, when the US started the Manhattan Project to make nuclear bombs, um at least the anecdote, I don't know to what extent this is true, but the anecdote is that like Russia got suspicious when they realized that there were all of the nuclear physicists stopped publishing papers for 2 years. And one can draw a parallel here in that like OpenAI and Anthropic are mysteriously absent from this conference, and maybe that's because they're in the end game. They're sort of like working towards AGI. Um, I also think it's interesting that like a lot of the applications of machine learning technologies is what DeepMind and Meta are there for. So like I had a friend from high school who was on a team that did essentially like a bracelet that measures electrical signals, and then based on those electrical signals can create a digital twin like model of your hand, and accurately represent what it's doing based on just the electrical signals. Um, while Meta's probably like interested in that for the like metaverse kind of stuff, there are a number of different applications to it, and like I would say that has real implications for people, like from people who could use that as the basis for like a prosthetic system, or much more. Like that is in a sense a product that is actually delivering on sort of this like incredible future that is being promised, at least to some extent. It's not there yet, but like is on the way. And I think like AlphaFold again is on the way, or at least can be used towards that. And I know there's like there's a whole academic like row, if you will, about that. But still, I think that it's at least trying to deliver on these promises. You do that with papers, in this like I would be surprised that like if there wasn't a really like interesting new development like that, it didn't show up at NeurIPS or ICLR as some sort of paper. Um, and I think that shows sort of like where the company's focuses are as well. Um, yeah, I guess I'm curious what you think in terms of their absence and what it might mean.
I am unsure, to be honest. Like, so we don't know whether they were really absent, right? Like, I don't think there's like a guest list public, and you can't like. I know there's a Hoover, but I don't like. Did you actually check like the app and like
Yeah, let me
check
yeah
the?
let me check right now, because it might have just been that they didn't have papers, I guess. Um, okay, so there's about like 80 people.
Out of 3,000 that they have right now, and then like Google Brain or Fair, how many are there?
Uh, I it will take me a long time to count this. Because like I just looked up DeepMind, and each letter category takes up more than a screen, except for like Q. That was not the case for OpenAI. Let's see, and then Anthropic, 11, 12, 13 people from Anthropic. And now, to be fair, this is only the people who have put that on their like Hoover app thing. So there may be some more, but I would say it's like an order, like almost an order and a half magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude difference between DeepMind and Anthropic, and like 1 order of magnitude difference between between OpenAI and DeepMind. And then Meta has essentially the same as DeepMind. So yeah.
It is fair to say that like OpenAI is underrepresented, but I think that was always the case, I guess, and they just don't have that many researchers actually. I wouldn't necessarily over guess there. I think a baseline for that maybe we can like add into the show notes and like just to move on here is like Samsung research or like like Databricks or like Salesforce, like stuff like isn't like ginormous multinational behemoths that actually make money, but it's like kind of like the same category. And if it doesn't show up, I mean, like they aren't doing research anymore, and they're not gonna share it. So I guess it makes sense. I think what could be interesting actually is patents, like because like Google does actually patent a lot of stuff, and I wonder if OpenAI has patents.
What are they going to patent?
Nothing apparently.
So, I mean, at least compared to Anthropic, like I just did Databricks and one of the other ones you said, and there were like 20. Um, but like apart research, we have 9 employees and like 50-ish fellows, and we had 10 people there. So
I think for whatever reason, it means we're gonna like decouple from the community to some degree. They still have 80 people there, and they're doing like laser focused like research with people and meeting when they might not feel it that quickly. But like I don't think there's any reason right now to assume some Manhattan project, even though they would really like that probably because it's very flattering.
oh yeah,
I
no,
would.
I don't think there's actually a Manhattan Project. I more just meant that they sort of they've gone into head down mode. They're grinding.
That's plausible, yeah. Uh, we will see whether that is a good choice for them to do. I generally think that like if you are actually ahead, you will continue to share, and not only if you are doing the ecosystem thing. Like one of the things that we talked about in previous episodes was that Meta and Google and Microsoft and Amazon they actually make money, and for them it's like a expanding a market play, and also like Hugging Face, for example, benefits by everyone doing ML basically. So they don't need to hoard things, but also in order to attract the best talent, you need to have them build careers. And like, as it turns out, a lot of smart people want to be professors and stuff like this. So Apple learned this lesson in the like early 2020s, I think, that like the best people will not work for you if they cannot publish.
Yeah.
So
And they've done a whole 180 on that. I was talking with a guy and I actually got the contact information shared with him, but he is essentially, as far as I could tell, their like pinch hitter for recruiting, and he was literally just transferred before NeurIPS into the Apple safety AI safety team. So they are recruiting hardcore for top talent in the privacy and safety spaces of AI. Worth noting.
yeah, but no muck, just something sus would be my summary of that theme of like an absence of actual papers. I mean, they never really did peer review
Yeah, that's
properly,
true.
but they used to at least have a presence to some degree and like make an effort to integrate.
Did they ever have like booths?
I I remember talking to might have been Alec Redford, like to OpenAI people at like a NeurIPS social and basically shitting on them for like telling a story around openness and then closing things.
Hmm.
So like they were around and they had like a presence. I think they were recruiting. But anyway, OpenAI and Anthropic no longer there. Um, I had gone through the papers just as we were preparing for episode, and I didn't actually see anything that like I was extremely excited about. There's some cool stuff ongoing in my field. Like there's like some research being pushed around schedule-free optimizers by Aaron DeFazio and some other people, and like
What
some
is
of that
that?
stuff.
Just for someone who doesn't know.
So right now, if you're using Atom, you have to like choose the learning rate and a
Yeah, yeah,
learning rate schedule.
yeah. Okay, cool.
And there's ongoing work on trying to make both of these things go away. You still have to choose the learning rate, but like for the schedule, we now have something that like relatively reliably, you don't need to pick like cosine and other shit anymore. You can just like tune in the learning rate and let it go, and then the longer you train, the better it gets. But like you never need to drop.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like advances in various fields, but nothing that I would say is like a game changer or a hard limit. Did you have stuff that you would say really excited you?
Um. Well, I guess this isn't a paper, but a lot of people seem to be embracing blue sky, which I am a big fan of. Let's get off of Twitter forever. Thank God. Um, and I think one thing that was beneficial to that is like it allows you to create your own algorithm essentially, and like the algorithms are open. Um, and being machine learning engineers and researchers, I think people like that because they understand the impact that that has on you. So yeah, I thought that was interesting and worth pursuing. So yeah, I if that's any indication of what like uh, how things will go, I would say invest in Blue Sky or whatever. Put your money, start putting your money towards Blue Sky because it looks pretty good. I've liked it so far. Um, I thought there was one that was interesting called Preference Learning Algorithms Do Not Learn Preference Rankings. Um, and I thought there was another one that was interesting called Model Collapse Demystified, The Case of Regression. Those two were neat and worth checking out. There, in terms of like tools, there was also one called Datry, which is said to be a library for efficient data attribution, and Detixify, which is creating scientific figures with ticks. Um, I cannot confirm that these are good, but they're worth checking out. I think
So
that's about
then,
it.
like, no big changes, and I think one thing that I would like to like bookend the episode with is when like going back to the benchmark thing. Uh, as of right now, nothing in the community indicates that there's like massive leaps going on, despite what has been claimed about the arXiv and the O3 evaluation.
Can you justify that for me? Because like, I think even like, so we're now getting into like O3, right? And what that means. And I think we talked about this somewhat, but like essentially making sure that we aren't just moving goalposts and saying constantly, like, oh, but it's not there yet. And we talked about some concrete ways that we could resolve this, which we may come back to in the future. But like, yeah, just I would like more context on why you believe that to be the case.
So just on what we were discussing with like the biggest themes that you picked up on, I mean also because of your bias, but I also didn't see anything else in the papers that were like massive shifts, was more benchmarks, better rigor. Basically,
Well,
like there wasn't like a,
calls for better rigor. I wouldn't say better rigor.
but like there wasn't really a, oh, we have a new diffusion model level leap ongoing. Like the biggest thing, the biggest buzzword I saw was at ICLR with the latent byte transformer, but also that wasn't like, oh wow, completely new. It's like slightly better scaling, like a better scaling coefficient. Like
Yeah.
neat. but like
one professor was repping XLSTM, which is like scaled LSTMs, and says that it's 20% more, or 20 times, not 20%, 20 times more efficient. But yeah, that was the only
I
thing
haven't
that I
seen
hit.
them trained to the level of transformers yet. So like let's see how that scales.
Yeah.
That's like one indication that like if the whole like theme and if the tutorials of the paper are not exciting new method, but like people, let's get our shit together, our evals are bad, then that does not speak to a feeling of massive advancements. And then the big shifts that are being pushed now is, oh yeah, we always knew that data was not going to work out, which is a gaslighting lie. Now it's about what to scale and test time compute. Is like, okay, where is the massive jump? And the jumps that we do see in the benchmark, they are accompanied by massive price tags, like 250K for arXiv and
That
fine
was the
tuning onto
approximate
it.
cost. So just for I think running arXiv, it took them 350K was my understanding, approximately. Source, I can include the source, but source is the AI explained video where he talks about that, and he's got like a way he figured that out, approximately, because they also said that they Arc was not allowed to publish how much money they spent, but they gave like a rough comparison, and then he used that.
It's always very trust inducing if you're constricting what can be said about the benchmark. And they fine tuned on it as well. And like I checked out the samples that Francois shared that it couldn't solve. It's really easy. So if it had a consistent way of solving everything, then it would have. So like my take is now that it random walked its way, and it goes back to this PNP thing. Where, like if as long as you have a function which tells you you're done, you can random walk your way into a solution. And it might be a very impressive random walk that is like way more efficient than previous random walks, but it's still not something that is like qualitatively better than we saw before. The trade-off thing still seems to be a thing that like there's no Pareto dominant improvement. So like I don't see that leap. And in this thing or discussion before, we kind of arrived at like a proper leap would be either if it just does better on all of the benchmarks that meaningfully translates to something real. So like SWE bench probably does to some degree with the caveat of this non-stationarity. Or you had mentioned a benchmark called Workbench, like an HR benchmark. WorkArena. And you said that like LLMs do not in fact automate boring HR tasks very well, but they score like 0% on like a hard task that they had.
That was my memory from the poster at NeurIPS. But I did a quick check of the paper and I couldn't find the same table. So there's an asterisk there for now, but I'm fairly certain that it was like that they had 3 difficulties. The lowest difficulty models did okay on, and then the upper 2 difficulties models essentially could not do. All right, so just to clarify, there are actually 2 papers here, and the one which was presented at NeurIPS was WorkArena++, the second of the 2 WorkArena papers. In this paper, the original WorkArena dataset was labeled as L1, with L2 and L3 being newly introduced. The models performed at essentially 0 across the board for both L2 and L3. And this was largely, I think, because of like context constraints. Like in these models, because of what has to be repeated. So these tasks essentially were or are structured that like you're given a like a task, you're given a goal, and either it's spelled out for you in the prompt, or you can use some sort of like RAG like system to go find the protocols within like onboarding material, for example. And then once you get there, the protocols are clearly laid out precisely as they should be taken. So
I'm seeing in table 2 a 0% success rate on average with like a 1.8 standard deviation.
yeah, but the one that was on the poster had zeros in like all of the columns and all of the rows once you got to a certain point. So
yeah, so like basically like with this caveat of like, as long as if it's a benchmark, it is like algorithmic enough that it is probably automatable if you have anything resembling a massive paradigm shift. And sure, you can put massive amounts of energy into the harness, but then like, is it really AGI at that point if you have a specialized harness for everything? So like the goalpost we kind of arrived at, like at what point is something like AGI or just like something like what was promised coming would be on any given task, like a single task, drop-in replacement for a human without degradation of service. So if it's a customer support rep, it needs to at least be like as good as a customer support rep, and like Turing test for like stuff that you pay for, and like without weird random failures. Because that is what was promised. Like that's like one of these gaslighting things again. Like what was promised in all of the hype decks was general intelligence, single thing, better at every single human thing, without needing massive amounts of pre-training, fine-tuning, harnessing. Even if we remove the every single thing, if you need a massive harness and RAG and other things in order to do a task, and then you still get degradation, that is not what was sold. So if we say you're allowed to do RAG, you're allowed to do a harness, but like a limited one, and then you can do drop-in replacement, that is like a very generous line in the sand that one can draw. In a previous episode, I had said like arXiv is like the benchmark that matters. I still think that holds true, but more in a necessary, not sufficient way. And what we see in these benchmarks at this conference, in the evaluation procedure, is like it really is important to be precise on what you claim, how you claim it, how you justify it, how it relates to the real world, and what effort you put in. The one thing that is a common thing in combinatorial optimization proofs nowadays is that you prove things in the terms of a number of bits that you encode the problem in. Because people started to like game the proofs. They said, "Oh, we prove this thing, and it now has like constant size in the runtime because we have encoded the whole thing such that the memory scales doubly exponentially now. And if you can run it, it's super fast, but also you need more memory than is in the universe or something like that." So, like this is now like exaggerating a bit, but like,
sure.
probably we need to start including like the cost of running the benchmark. Otherwise, people will just like keep upping the amount of money you can pump into it for the benchmark, and then if you run it, you get the Devon video where like a YouTuber, which apparently we now have software engineering YouTubers.
I love it.
Got Devon to fail the command of push directly to master because Devon had a harness strapped onto it that forces it to do pull requests for everything. But when the human reviews, so it's like clever inversion of responsibility and putting the difficult stuff to the human again, which can be useful. We're not arguing that it's not useful, but it's not what was promised, and it's like a gaslighting thing, which was what I would close the muck evaluation of this thing on. But NeurIPS itself, I think we can say like relatively muck free. Maybe also because of no Anthropic and OpenAI presentations.
Yeah, I would say overall, I mean, I loved it. It was a really good experience. I really enjoyed going, and it is encouraging to see like the good research and the people that care as well. because I do think that was present. So
However, it is not worth sabotaging your colleagues for best paper awards at NeurIPS, no matter how cool NeurIPS might be.
no, yeah, and I guess with that, maybe that is all the muck that we can handle for today. We will definitely be back in the new year with more interesting analysis on O3, close read of the Anthropic scheming evals paper, which I have not read yet, but Igor, you thought it was actually like pretty solid, if I remember correctly.
So like the bar's on the floor, but as far as AGI risk papers go, this was a good one. I did a whole tweet thread around. I still have nitpicks, but they did try to cover things, and they did say things like, we use the model preferences here in the sense of revealed preferences of a system that acts consistently towards like a specific thing. We don't mean to imply that it actually has like human-like wants and needs, which is the first time I see this in an AI risk paper. So, like, kudos.
Yeah, that's badass, if I do say so myself. I love it when people actually acknowledge that, words have baggage that they bring with them, and yeah.
The limitation section is, I think, 1 or 2 pages, while the abstract is only half a page, which is like a very good ratio to
Yeah,
have.
that's appropriate.
Like, from a
So,
science perspective, good paper. Still disagree with the takes, but technically, kudos.
and that is what we will leave you with. So have a good holiday, or if you're listening to this in the future, whatever time it is for you. We'll see you next time.